Hi. So I'm Robert Norris. I'm the founder and lead for Grandparents for Public Schools. We got this whole thing started in August of 2023 when it became clear that there's no other advocacy organization for grandparents. We're kind of, we're either parents or we're doing other advocacy, but we're generally not here for just for grandparents. So it seemed like a good idea and it caught on pretty quickly. Um, but yeah, we're statewide now. We have over 500 members in our private group. Um, and can't remember what our total number is, depends on how you cut it in our website. But we're looking to use these interviews as a way to make connections that we don't have just yet and want to have. So we're very stoked about that. We are going to be having a series of interviews over the next few months. That's going to include people like you three, probably Jennifer Bashir, I understand, Tracy, and
Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Snyder.
Jack Schneider, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also looking at some folks to talk about school district funding and problems that school districts are having financially. This particular interview I'm really excited about because we need to talk about book banning and school censorship. It's so important right now. And I know that y'all three have been involved in this area for a long, long time. So I'm really excited to see that you folks are here. I know Frank has been doing this kind of work for quite a while. I liked it. He talked about his daughter and wanting to make sure that she had access to the same great books that he had. Lainey, I like it that you're a storyteller and live in Fort Worth because that's my hometown. Anne, I think it's interesting that you associate yourself either with Houston or with Katy, but it seems like Katy is the one you associate yourself with now. And you were actually involved in a book banning fight up in Katy too. So, so we're here. I wanted to hear from the folks that are with Freedom to Read Project about what have y'all been doing? How'd you get started and what's going on? What's the state of affairs in book banning? So Lainey, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So I'll kind of tell just like the brief story of what brought us together here at the Texas Freedom to Read Project. It started in fall of 2021. That's kind of where I got involved. I have 4 children in public school. Right now, they range from starting 3rd grade is my youngest in a few weeks, hooray. And my oldest will be starting his junior year of high school. I've got one that's going to be a freshman, a daughter, and then a son that's going to be starting 6th grade. So we are busy at my house. But in fall of 2021, I noticed some wild stuff happening in my school district. It all started with Matt Krause and his, 800 books to watch out for in your school district, right? That might make children uncomfortable, things like that. And I just saw this really quick attack on books. It kind of came out of nowhere. What felt like it came out of nowhere. And before I knew it, I had people in my community demanding dozens and dozens of books be pulled off of shelves. I got involved very quickly because that made me concerned. I joined book challenge committees. I started going to all of my school board meetings. Unbeknownst to me and to a lot of us in the community, what we thought was some, singular parents in our community who were concerned about these books was not grassroots. It was a coordinated attack to get a lot of press and media coverage. They had lists, they had books, they had a plan. We didn't realize that PACs from around the country were involved. They had already handpicked candidates that they were going to fund their campaigns for school board the next session. And then within a few months, school board season started, and we had 3 candidates that were funded with hundreds of thousands of dollars from outside of the district who won those seats and ultimately took over my children's school board. And with those 3 and 1 on the board who was on their side, ultimately they now had a majority. And the first thing they promised to do was to make sure that what they deemed inappropriate books would be pulled from shelves. They created a book banning rubric to really reduce books to a checklist. They overturned all of the book challenge committees that we as parents had been involved in to save these books. And I was frustrated. So I went to Twitter and I started tweeting about it. And for a long time, I was tweeting into like, my 23 followers. There was no one even listening, but I was so desperate. I was taking pictures. I was at school board meetings. I was talking to anyone who would listen. And I was lucky enough to serve on a book challenge committee for The Diary of Anne Frank, the graphic novel adaptation, and tweeting about that and how they overturned our committee and pulled that book off of shelves again. That tweet was enough to get the attention of a lot of different people. One of those was Frank, who's our co-founder. And then another one of them, I think at the time and a little bit later, was Anne, another co-founder, and ultimately started working really hard to fight against the censorship in my district and started to talk to other parents across the state who were up against the exact same political battle. We realized we were all fighting the same money. We were fighting all the tactics were the same. It was coordinated. They were coordinating. They were sending groups into school districts, pretending to be grassroots. And so Anne reached out to me one day and to Frank and said, hey, the three of us are doing all this work. We're talking to each other. We've been working with other organizations like Pen America and Every Library. And she said, what do you think we get together and found, an organization in Texas called the Texas Freedom to Read Project. And Frank and I said, let's do it. We were already fighting. We were already doing the work. And we said, we're in, let's go. And that's where we are today. And we founded the organization just this last December. So we're 6 months old, but the three of us have been working together. I don't know, for like a year and a half. I like to tell the story that Frank and I became friends when someone accused me of working with him. And it was this liberal man in Austin, Texas, that I must be working with him. And we'd interacted on Twitter briefly, but I was like, oh, well, I guess I got to be friends with whoever this guy Frank is. And that's where he and I met. And Anne and I met on Twitter as mothers who were both fighting these book banning rubrics in our school districts. So we came together and we decided we wanted to create an organization where we could utilize the skills that we have gained from fighting this in our own school districts, because we're seeing it all over the state, and how we could share those resources with other parents, grandparents, obviously, because here we are talking to you, and how we could share our knowledge, how we could share resources, how we could coordinate, how we could support each other and coach each other to fight the same battle. We ultimately realized they're coordinating to pull the books. Why not? We should be coordinating to fight this. And it's also been it's clear that this is an attack on public education as well. It's clear that this is like, a little piece of that puzzle to undermine educators, to undermine librarians, because they want to erode public trust in public education so they can fund their vouchers. And we just said, no, we're going to fight for educators. We're going to fight for librarians. We're going to fight for the freedom to read. So I don't know, Anne, Frank, what would you add to that? Let's hear Anne and Frank. Let's hear your intros and tell me what you'd add.
Okay, I'll jump in. I'm Anne Russi, as Lainey said, and Robert said I'm a co-founder of Texas Freedom to Read Project as well. I am a mother to 2 elementary-aged daughters in Katy ISD, which is a large suburb outside of Houston. Lainey did such a good job kind of telling like our origin story. I think what I might add is a couple of things. We did see like what was happening in Texas also was not necessarily unique just to Texas. We watched this happen especially in Florida. We kind of would have these like message exchanges where we're like, are we in a race to the bottom on this? Like, what is happening in these states? Like, it felt so scary and overwhelming, but also sort of validating that Texas wasn't alone in this. And so when we decided, yes, we're going to go for it, we're going to try to form an organization for Texas, looked to Florida Freedom to Read Project, who was also working with Pen America and Every Library and doing some amazing work just on their own, advocating for similar issues and against censorship in Florida schools and public libraries. And so Stefana and Reagan there generously like offered their wisdom and insight, and we didn't have to completely recreate the wheel We look at them kind of as like big sisters, their organization as a big sister organization to ours. And I think Frank says, like, we just try to copy everything they do because they do such a good job with it. So, and they've allowed us the freedom to be able to do that. I guess the other thing I'll add is I think part of what prompted us to form our own organization was specifically geared towards parents and community members and grandparents. Was we had coordinated and been working with like librarians, see the organization that like Carolyn Foote and Becky Calzado with Freedom Fighters were doing. That was a very librarian focused. We saw what Students Engaged in Advancing Texas, SEAT, student and youth-led advocacy organization, as well as some other amazing groups and organizations in Texas. And I noticed, especially during the last legislative session, and you all might have noticed too, that parents, it felt like we're kind of absent, not all parents, so I'm sure there were some there, but it felt like broadly parents were kind of missing from the advocacy and testimony and showing up at the legislative hearings and things like that to offer input on the legislation, especially around book bans and censorship that was happening. And so I think part of our hope is like getting our act together and maybe being a little bit late in like an organized way to the table, but really want to be more intentional going forward of making sure we're helping to organize parents to show up alongside our grandparents and students and librarians and educators. So I will stop, but I would love to hear Frank. I know it's hard to go third. So
No,
you
it's
just
fine.
talked a lot, but introduce yourself and share whatever else.
Well, one thing that I really want to underline that Lainey and Ann said is sort of the generalized nature of these attacks on books. Because my story is a little bit different. Lainey and Ann are both in districts where there have been a lot of specific fights over books, and I'm in Austin, and in Austin ISD that has not really been a thing. But my story, I'm also an English teacher, and I noticed very early on that these fights in Keller, in Katy, in some of the districts surrounding Austin, Eames and Leander, for example, were creating a momentum that was filtering up to the state level. It was filtering up to the state legislature, to where new laws were being passed. First, it was the anti-CRT bill in the second to last legislative session, and then of course, HB 900 in the last legislative session. So what I say is what happens in one district does not stay in one district, it spreads. And so that's what really got me drawn into these statewide fights. And I started focusing on school board races and trying to provide people with information about school board candidates who either were really great about resisting book bans or who were, joining this movement to restrict ideas from students. And that's how I got involved on Twitter with Lainey and Ann. So that's my perspective. Again, the thing that I want to emphasize is that this is a statewide thing, and even if you are in Austin, even if you are in a city where this has not been an issue, it is going to be an issue, and it is becoming an issue because of the way this filters up. All right, back to Lainey.
Yeah, I was going to say one thing I wanted to add as Ann and Frank were talking that something we also like to talk about, and that there was a point I think where Ann and Frank and many other people in the state are asking, who's going to stop this, right? Like who's going to say that we can't do this anymore? Who's going to say this is enough, right? Who's going to take charge? Who's going to tell everyone that this is what we need to do next? And there's a moment in advocacy when you become really passionate where you have to look in the mirror and you realize, oh, it's us, right? Like, oh, we have to form the organization, right? Like I wanted, and I wanted the ACLU to come in and just sweep everything up and pick up the pieces and sue the district for me. And I wanted this group to come in and I wanted them to save it. And I wanted lawyers to be lining up to defend us. And it doesn't quite work that way, especially in Texas. And so there was that realization that it has to be us. Like we're the real people that it's affecting. My children have lost hundreds and hundreds of books that will never be purchased and books that were pulled off of shelves. And I'm going to fight it. And so sometimes, you know, like I think that's what we want to talk to people about is we talk to all of you here and you're all in different districts. I saw someone from New Braunfels, right? I see these names we've got all over the place. I've got Plano and Capel. We need parents and grandparents and connections in every district across the state. And we need your help, every last one of you, because we don't actually want to come into school districts like some of these other organizations we're fighting against who want to come in and tell everyone what to do. We don't have a list of books that we are demanding everyone put on their bookshelves, right? Unlike the other side that has a list of books that they're demanding you remove from your bookshelves. Funny enough, when they come in with these lists of books, they don't actually care if those books are in your library or not, right? These lists aren't specific to districts. They're coming in with a list of 600 books. One of them we've seen now. I'm going to have, maybe Anne will love to tell you about the traveling pastor circus that we call it. They come in with this list of books. They don't even ask you if you have it in your district, and they say, remove all of these books. They read, you know, these excerpts. And so we don't want to do that. We don't want to come in and tell school districts what to do. We want to empower parents and grandparents. We want to connect with people in their own communities because you know your community best, right? Like this really is a grassroots effort. We want to help you fight for the freedom to read in your community. And so that's why we need everybody's help. We're not going to come do it for you per se. We don't have the bandwidth. I don't know if you all know this, but there are more than 1,200 school districts in Texas. Some of them are teeny tiny and some of them are huge. And we can't do all that work. But we want to empower those who do want to do the work, and we want to support them and connect with them and, you know, put them in contact with other smaller groups, maybe put them in contact with authors who want to come and speak at their school board meetings, maybe put them in contact with organizations who can help. But yeah, Anne, why don't you tell them about the traveling pastor circus? Because I think this is a really important story that people realize what could happen in their school district.
Sure. Yeah. So I don't know, many of you have probably seen clips played on the news or perhaps at your own school board meetings where parents or grandparents or people claiming to be parents or just not identifying how that they're related to your district because they probably aren't part of your district at all are coming in and reading like out of context sentences or passages from books that are typically like YA, like young adults or adult leveled books that would be available to secondary or high school students. A couple that you've probably heard are from like Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl, where one of the characters is like a potty mouth teenager who just says all kinds of really offensive things, but that's like part of his charm in a weird way. Like the story is a lot about so much more than the profanity that the characters use. And I always say a lot of the words that are said at these school board meetings from books, I only know the meaning of them because I attended public high school. Like that is where I learned the meaning of a lot of these words. So teenagers are not offended or alarmed by profanity or a lot of the things they read in books, or they're designed to be shocking and alarming to elicit some kind of emotional reaction from the reader for a purpose. But anyways, you've probably seen these kind of what we would say are like political stunts being done at board meetings where sometimes the reader of the passage will get asked to stop cussing. And then they say, well, if I can't say the word in the meeting, then the book shouldn't be on the shelves. Things like that. So this summer, I would say, is that when the circus started, Frank? Was like around May, maybe. We started noticing this trend of pastors showing up at these school board meetings. It would be a group of pastors, a couple that have churches in the Houston area that we pretty quickly figured out were associated, thanks to some reporting by a Texas Observer, like pieced together that they're associated with a group called the Remnant Alliance. And they are associated with Citizens Defending Freedom, who some of you may be familiar with. They've been a pretty active group driving a lot of the book bans in our communities throughout the state. But this group of pastors was going around and basically taking the video clips from their like stunts at board meetings where they would get all this reaction from trustees or the audience, or they would drum up a bunch of outrage from the public or parents, and then posting those things on social media, posting like photos with superintendents saying we had a great conversation with the Mission ISD superintendent, and there was some great reporting that Frank shared. That was the Texas Observer piece, and I can drop in the chat too some reporting from like the Rio Grande Valley in particular that had been kind of from what we understand, like not really targeted by a lot of this stuff. They seem to have kind of zoned in on like the Rio Grande Valley to demand that this book of 676 titles, this list of 676 book titles be removed from school libraries. We were able to read the list thanks to a journalist who obtained the information through a public records request. And it included titles like The Color Purple, the Anne Frank Diary, the graphic adaptation that Lainey said, A House on Mango Street, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye and Beloved, an Eric Carle, like Draw Me a Star, picture book, just the most outrageous, non-pornographic, non-offensive books you could possibly imagine. And some of the most important books that we absolutely believe should at least be considered in their entirety and kept, available for students when they are old enough to be able to engage with the content and material, and or to be used in classrooms. So many of the titles, like Frank would say, are AP exam titles as well. So they have an academic purpose, and we're putting students at a disadvantage when districts are banning and removing books that can be featured on the AP exams. So this traveling pastor circus, they seem to have kind of died off. Like, I feel like they hit a board meeting recently that didn't actually live stream their meetings. I think it was Leander they tried to visit. And so they had plans to go and they kind of fizzled. They may have realized they weren't being recorded and weren't going to be able to use the material. And so that might have been unappealing to them. But they seem, I don't know, they seem to have kind of fizzled recently.
And I was going to say it's the summer, right?
Yeah.
And so things have died down, but this is an organization that we would recommend you look for in your school districts. If you're starting to hear word about organizations that are coming to your school district to threaten your trustees to remove this list of 676 books, you need to get involved. It's time to show up at these meetings, right? Like Anne said, they read one passage from one book on the list that may have some sexual material in it. And then they say that all of the books on the list are like that, right? They imply that, and it's just not true, right? It's simply not true. And so you need to get involved. You need to go to your school board meetings. You need to talk to your trustees. You need to find out, like where it's headed and watch for these organizations. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw this group come back together in the fall and start. But one thing that Anne mentioned that's so funny is we did realize that they probably don't want to come to board meetings that aren't live streamed. Like if they can't have their circus show and they don't get to be on the news and upset people and they're not live streamed, all of a sudden they lose all the wind in their sails, right? Because they're not really there about books, right? This is a politically motivated behavior. They're there to undermine public education. They're there, and a lot of them are being paid to be there. We also did some work. We found out one of the groups, this man is paid a lot of money to travel. He went to Midland ISD in March. This man is paid maybe tens of thousands of dollars to go to these school board meetings and speak out against these books. And he lives like in South Carolina, right? And he walks into this Midland, Texas school board meeting pretending to be one of them, and he's not.
Yeah.
Frank, did you want to kind of add something to that?
I did, yeah. So, and in addition to, like, I think Anne pointing out that the group does seem to be fizzling, and we don't know if that's just because they've lost energy or what, but we do know that there are effective ways to handle them. And what happened in Leander ISD was actually the trustees were warned beforehand. They prepared a statement saying, basically reiterating their book policy and leaving it at that. And it was effective because what they're trying to do is yes, get on the news, but also provoke a reaction from the trustees, get thrown out of the meeting. So if the trustees are calm, if they're prepared, if they know what's coming, and that's something that we can do, we can let trustees know that that's happening, and it's really effective at sort of bringing down the temperature of these obviously political attacks.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think it was so. Tracy said in the chat that large school districts are required to live stream. I think Fredericksburg was the one that is not live streaming, and that's a really small district. The Leander one was live streamed. Yeah.
So how would a person know in advance that they need to pay attention to a school board meeting or a school board election? What are there certain things that they should watch for to know if this is going to come up at a school board meeting? Or is it just kind of like, it happened?
That is a great question. And I'll start with this. But one thing is I do recommend, we keep an eye on this. We monitor. So follow us on social media. And if we will also, this is part of why we ask what district you're in. We want to be able to reach out and know people in districts where we can send you emails saying, hey, this group is coming. Keep an eye out for the name Remnant Alliance. Keep an eye out for the name Richard Vega, who is sort of the pastor who has been taking the lead on this. There are a couple of other names that aren't coming to me right now. But if we see Richard Vega is saying, hey, I'm going to Fredericksburg in August, then we start preparing. Yeah, also just a sign that it might be happening is if you notice that your book policy is on your agenda, or if it's coming up for discussion, which in most districts it's, and Anne and Lainey can talk a lot more about this, it's the EFB local policy or EFA local policy. If you see that that's coming up for discussion, that's a good sign that there's going to be drama around books, especially if that's been something that people have been talking about in public comments at your school board meetings, which you can watch online just by Googling Leander ISD school board meeting video. A lot of them are on YouTube. Some of them are on the district website. Did I answer that question? Was there anything I missed, guys?
I can add to it a little bit. And I would just say, this is why it's really important for you to just understand the pulse of what's going on in your school district, right? Even if there's no fire per se, do you know, I mean, I could ask every one of you right now, do you know your school board trustees in the district you live in? And if the answer is you don't know them or where they stand on this, then you aren't going to know when it's coming. So my first piece of advice would be to get to know your trustees, to find out who they are. And I don't know what that's going to look like. It might be you scour their social media pages. It might be you talk to people. It might be you just go. I've got someone in the chat. I do now. Thanks to you, Lainey. Somebody here's from Keller ISD. I love it. Thank you, Elizabeth. You need to go to a few school board meetings, get a feel for them, introduce yourself, get to know them. That way, when something does happen and something does come, you're already ahead of the game. You have personal relationships with the trustees. You've been to school board meetings. You know where they stand. Yeah, you don't want to be caught, like I was caught back in 2021, where it just kind of came out of left field. So my recommendation to everyone is to get involved every day right now. Know who your school board trustees are, know where they stand on public education funding, right? Know where they stand on vouchers. If they are very pro voucher, you probably could get a slight idea as to where they stand on book banning, right? Like you can get a feel for these things. You can put 2 and 2 together. Ask if you don't want to talk about book banning specifically, talk about vouchers, find out where they stand on that and start to get a feel. So that's my advice, is start now getting to know these people and you won't be caught off guard. Anything that you would add?
Yeah, can I jump in? So Cheryl is in McKinney, and she said that she had the same group of people come month after month. Yeah, and I've written a lot about McKinney. So I know that sometimes there's just a local group that is connected with these larger national groups. It could be Moms for Liberty. Another one that's really active right now is Citizens Defending Freedom, and they have been coming. There's a branch in Collin County, and I know that they've been in Plano ISD, they've been at board meetings, and Lovejoy is their big place right now. So they're affiliated with the Remnant Alliance, so they're not the traveling pastor circuits, but they're doing the same thing. So if there is a Citizens Defending Freedom chapter in your county, and you can go to Citizens Defending Freedom, just look them up online and look and see if they have one in your county. it is very likely that they are working to get books removed from the schools in your district. They are very organized. They copy and paste their letters from district to district. So if that's happening there, it's probably happening in your district.
I would also say a good resource for people in your community who probably have a good pulse on like, are we dealing with this? Have we been having book challenges? If you're not sure, is to check in with any educators or librarians that you know, or like retired educators or librarians, because they're often even more free to kind of tell you exactly what they know. And sometimes they can be vocal in speaking up in defense of books and librarians and fellow educators, where people who are still employed by the districts, run by some of these boards, that are facilitating a lot of the censorship, like may not feel comfortable speaking out. But retired educators and librarians have been really wonderful voices to have in the boardrooms during public comment, or even just to have as resources and friends who can help both encourage us and help us understand what is happening, or who we might be able to talk to learn more about what's happening in a certain community. So I just wanted to offer that.
And if you get to the point where you're seeing your district start on fire, or you're seeing something really concerning and you don't know who to talk to, and there doesn't seem to be anyone to turn to, reach out to us, right? Like, you can email any of it from the three of us. You can submit, you can go to our Twitter and DM us. You can go to Instagram and send us a message. Please reach out to us, and we may know something about your district. We might know someone in your district who's already working hard and you can join forces with them, or that might be you, right? It's like, okay, we're going to empower you. And this is where we just like to get the people who are willing to be a contact in your school district. So say, for example, we jump on Facebook and we see that CDF, or which is Citizens Defending Freedom, or this Remnant Alliance, or some other organization has a plan for a district and they're going to visit, or they start complaining about a certain district. We can go to our little list and say, who do we know? Who have we been in contact with that lives in that district? That's who we want to reach out to. So that's why it's so important for us to gather this information. If you're comfortable, you're not promising us anything. We aren't going to ask anything of you. We may just reach out if we need help in your specific district, or if we see something happening. So we are here to offer those resources. We're here to support you through that, to help you know what you need or who you need to talk to. Please don't ever be afraid to reach out to us.
So do you see
Terry, yeah.
getting involved in these fights?
Can you repeat that question one more time?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Do you see grandparents getting involved in these fights?
So I just want to share, I'll share really quickly. One of our most recent trustees, who unfortunately is very actively involved in the removal of books and censoring things, is a grandfather. And that is why he ran, is to fight for his grandkids, right? To protect them from what he thinks is inappropriate things in schools. But yeah, so we're seeing grandparents on both sides. In fact, I would say there are a lot of grandparents involved on the side that wants to censor books, right? And so, yes, please, we need grandparents who are also fighting for the freedom to read and fighting for public education. Like, no question. Yes, yes, yes.
So yeah, definitely we can, all of us GPS, we can work with y'all. Because we've got our contacts, we've got our Facebook page. But we can talk about this offline, but yeah, we can work with each other.
Well, and I think, I don't know if it was Robert, you, or it was Terry, or both of you, that told me, hey, like, we're grandparents, we're retired, we have maybe a little more time than some of the rest of you do, right? Like, you might have your afternoons off that some of us are busy picking up kids from school and getting dinner ready for, and dropping off at soccer practice. So yes, as parents, and that's the perspective we represent, we desperately need your help.
Yeah.
And don't forget, us grandparents pick up kids also, by the way. But I do have a question.
We'll take that help as well.
I do have a question for you guys, though. What are you planning next January when the legislature comes back into session?
Frank, Frank, let's take this.
We are currently monitoring, like, we have an idea of what bills are going to be filed. We don't know exactly how they're going to be worded. We don't know exactly what they're going to look like, but we do have a pretty good idea of what people who are involved in removing books, not just, and I want to be clear, this is not just from schools, but also from public libraries, and it expands from there, what their intents are for the next legislative session. And they're pretty onerous. So we will definitely will help organize. We work really well with a lot of different partner organizations. And when I say we, I really mean like we are connected to so many other groups, Students Engaged in Advancing Texas, which is a student group, Authors Against Book Bans, which is an authors group, and of course groups like the ACLU and PEN America in every library. So we're going to be working with those guys and the Texas Freedom Network to make sure that we have people ready to speak on those really harmful bills that are coming up, that we know are coming up, and hopefully get to talk to some legislators as well. And Lainey, do you have anything to add?
I just want to add, this Children's Defense Fund is another organization we work with really closely, and they are just on top of things when it comes to the state legislature. So they are, a great resource for us. I think it's really important to point out that up until recently, state legislatures weren't trying to legislate what books every single school had in their school libraries, right? The purpose of school boards was for them to come in and say, you know your community best. You should make these decisions for your community. And then when the state legislature in Texas, we've seen it in Florida, we've seen it in Utah, we've seen it in Idaho, all of a sudden, they don't love all the decisions that the local school boards are making. They decide they want to get involved and put their fingers in there and say, we're going to override this. And so it's kind of a new thing for state legislatures to start really micromanaging libraries at this level. But it is terrifying because you could have the most amazing school board in the world, right? They are so friendly for the freedom to read. But if the state legislature wants to pass all these laws that ties their hands, then we're out of luck. So it's really important. And Terry and Robert, and I know your organization has been so good at being at the state legislature and speaking at some of these meetings. So we're talking State Board of Education, which Tracy Fisher knows all about. We're talking the state legislature. They're starting to pass policies there that are tying the hands of even the most wonderful, book-friendly and anti-censorship school boards. So it is really important. And like Frank said, we already kind of know what some of them are. We have one state legislator who is behind HB 900, one of the more recent laws. He's angry that a portion of the law he wrote has been enjoined. Ultimately, at this point, it's not applicable because they are fighting it and saying it's unconstitutional. He says, if you really shut this down, we're going to take it a step further. We're going to pass a law that puts librarians in prison, and if they hand these books out. So yeah, we already know they have every intent to criminalize librarians. They like to try and one of the big things that we're probably going to see, Anne and Frank, you can let me know what you think about this. We're probably going to see them in new laws come up with new definitions. One of the things that keeps getting them in trouble and that keeps them from being able to write the laws they want is there are these really strict definitions as to what's obscene, right? Or there are these rules that we're seeing and they don't like those. So they want to rewrite the penal code, right? They want to redefine what obscenity means so that it applies to some of these books they don't like. So that's one of the things we probably see on the horizon. There's a lot, but yeah, I don't know. Anything else, Anne, Frank?
I was just gonna, sorry.
Well, I just want to
Go ahead.
quickly piggyback on what Lainey said and just help make people understand the implications of that. So if they are able to, in fact, change the definition of harmful to minors, that could make it a felony to sell some of these books that they're upset about. Like not just have them in schools, but to have them in public libraries or to sell them to
like Barnes and Noble. Yeah, like Barnes and Noble will have to put an XXX sign outside of their store.
Dramatic, drastic stuff that I don't think they understand the implications of what they're trying to do. And so it's going to be really important for us and hopefully for you guys to help us to make sure that the legislators, the moderate legislators, even anybody that's reasonable understands exactly what that's going to mean for not just schools, but also just for the freedom of information in the state of Texas.
So is there a list of legislators that are friendly to freedom to read? I mean, I think voting for legislators who are, advocating for this freedom is where I think the most impact will be made. You
So
can go
we-
beyond.
I do just want to say we are a 501c3 nonprofit, so we are not legally allowed to endorse any candidates. But I agree with you, and I think we can like unequivocally say yes, like look for candidates, politicians who align with your values. And obviously, as
Yeah.
an organization, we advocate really hard around the freedom to read and freedom of information. We can't tell you like who that is. I don't think we can safely, or I'm not comfortable doing that as an organization, but I think Grandparents for Public Schools potentially maybe can, or you can look to, I'm trying to think like, do some Googling, do some reading in your papers or reaching out to your legislators. You can look at how legislators voted on HB 900. That would be a good source of information. House Bill 900 is the Reader Act. And so kind of looking into that, who supported the Reader Act, who perhaps put forth amendments that would have helped protect the freedom to read or might have mitigated some of the worst consequences of that legislation. I hope I'm not saying anything out of line or like getting too specific there in terms of like definitely not trying to endorse anyone
Yeah.
or
right?
whatever
And I
the
don't think,
opposite
yeah.
is
I don't,
endorsing.
I
But
don't think,
I think that's
I don't
a
think
really
you
good
are.
resource. Look at how people voted on that bill, and that will tell you a lot. And then be watching, right? Like as they campaign. I don't know, Frank or Lainey, if you have anything you want to.
I was just going to say, it's like your school board trustees. All of you only have one state representative and one state senator that represents you in your house, right? So all you really have to do is research those two people to begin with, because that's where you're voting. So really, that's ultimately like where your job comes in, where it's time for you to look and ask yourself, who's your, how many of you right now could answer who's your state representative in Austin? We're not talking Washington, D.C., although that is important as well, but state's really important. Who is your state rep in the House, the Texas House, and who is your state senator in the Texas Senate? And then you got to get online. You got to make some phone calls. You got to talk to people, right? Because this isn't along party lines either. It's not like you can say, well, if they're a Democrat, they're this. Or if they're Republican, they're this. It's not always like that. So get to know who your reps are. We would probably recommend Twitter is a really great place to very quickly find out where they stand if they have an active Twitter account, because there's just a lot going on there. You can look, but yeah, get to know people, chat with them, go to a town hall, go to your, local precinct meeting, whether that's the Dems or the Republicans, go to that meeting, chat with people. And that's where you're going to build community anyway, and where you're going to be powerful. So yeah, that was what I would recommend.
I maybe I'll just chime in too with kind of a plug for Every Library as an organization who does a ton of advocacy work around libraries and a lot of this legislation that we're seeing come up throughout the country. It's one word, I think it's like everylibrary.org, but they've been a wonderful like partner and cheerleader in the work we're doing. And we've just learned a lot from the experts that they have on their team, and they may be a good resource. I don't know that they like endorse candidates, but they certainly advocate hard against book banning legislation, and may be able to point you towards some additional resources as well.
So I remember when my kids were in school here in Texas, that the biggest deal that my kids loved was when the Scholastic book list came out and you could order books through Scholastic. Where is Scholastic in all of this? Do they even still exist? And if they do, what have they been saying about book banning? You guys are laughing, so I guess I
Yeah, take that one, Frank.
No. I wanted to point to Lainey, because I think Keller is probably where this has been a very controversial issue in Texas.
I mean,
yeah, and then Lainey, you talk about Keller, and then I'll talk about Conrad.
I was just going to say book fairs have caused, so nowadays they don't do that little paper one as often, although they still occasionally do. And so, yes, to answer your question, Scholastic absolutely still exists, and they are the #1 book fair provider probably in America. And these book fairs are kind of like that, where the kids invite their grandparents to come and buy books with them, and they want, and they earn money. And book fairs have become politicized because all the bad books, right, in these bookshelves, and we've seen it cause a lot of problems, to the point where many districts, not mine yet, knock on wood, but my neighbor, they have decided to ban book fairs, specifically to ban Scholastic. So we laugh about Scholastic because Scholastic themselves have been seeped in the controversy from top to bottom. But yeah, they are a publisher, and I think they've probably joined a few lawsuits, right, in book banning efforts. So yeah, every publisher is involved, but Scholastic, the book fair publisher, they're deeply wrapped up into a lot of this. All right, Frank, what were you going to say?
Yeah, and so there has been an effort too from some of the same people who are trying to get books removed from schools to not only remove Scholastic but replace it with a different company called Skytree Book Fairs, which is a market for Brave Books, which is a series of books that have conservative messages, essentially. So if you see somebody talking about Brave Books at your school board, or getting rid of Scholastic, or choosing to go with Skytree Book Fairs, that's what's behind that. There's this idea that Scholastic is woke, so let's replace that book fair with this very ideological, conservative type of book fair.
We want to add, we're not for banning conservative books. Like, that's not who we are. We are for the freedom to read, right? Our problem is that these groups that are coming in to speak at school board meetings, claiming to, be parents supportive. We saw this, Frank, you can tell, in Conrose. Turns out they worked for Skytree Book Fairs, right? Turns out there's money in it. And that's part of it, is they want to make all this money. So yeah, that's another conversation to watch for. But yeah, book fairs are definitely a part of it. And we are not against conservative books or even Skytree, unless the purpose is to ban other books. And that's when we have a problem with it.
So what works when you're going to, a school district, and they've got board meetings and all this other stuff, and they want to ban this book and ban that book? What can you do to stop it in its tracks?
Oh, it's such a good question. But Frank, what comes to mind for you?
So I think we should probably tell the story of LaGrange, because that was a place where we had a major victory. So in LaGrange, Texas, which is a small district halfway between Austin and Houston, if you don't know, there was a trustee who flagged 4 books that were being purchased, that were on the purchase list. And he said, we should not buy these books. They're filth. They've been removed from other districts. And someone working in the district had flagged them for him and said, these have been pulled from other districts. And these were not sexually inappropriate books. These were not educationally unsuitable, not pervasively vulgar books. But for whatever reason, they had been challenged or removed in other districts. And so we got notification of that from Kelly Jensen, who is a national reporter who works on censorship issues. And if you follow her on social media, you will learn a lot. She told us, and then we connected with a bunch of different other groups. Lainey reached out to people in the Facebook group in LaGrange. We were able to get citizens to write letters to the editor, to write reasonable letters to board members. Authors Against Book Bans stepped in, and some of the authors of the books wrote letters to the trustees, which is actually a really effective tactic that has also worked in Conroe ISD. Trustees are impressed when they get a sensible, reasonable letter from an author of a book that they're trying to challenge. And it worked. All 4 books were sailed through. Is there anything, Anne, you know the story pretty well too. Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that sums it up really well. But I do think, maybe just to reiterate something Frank just said, like, being reasonable and calm and kind of level-headed, I think is really important, because that's not really what they're getting from the other side. If you watch these like irate people go up to the dais and scream at trustees or like tell them they're pedophiles and groomers and they should be in jail and like all of this like wild stuff. It's really hard to watch, and I can only imagine how hard it is to be on the receiving end of it. So while I know I do get emotional sometimes when I go and talk to my trustees, especially because several of them are very active in trying to ban and remove books. I do try to be accurate in what I'm saying, and I try to be kind when as often as possible. But I think that's really important. That all we're asking as school districts follow their existing policies, that they don't just get reactive and try to appease these people that are coming up there yelling at them and accusing them of wild things. They have rules and procedures and policies in place that both protect students from harmful materials and protect students' First Amendment rights. And so it's really important that we remind trustees and school administrators that there are parents, taxpayers, voters, grandparents who expect them to kind of stand up to people that are adults that are throwing temper tantrums and acting really out of line and just making demands of them. Like, those rules are there and policies are there for a reason. And it's not unreasonable to tell a grown-up, we hear you, fill out this form as our procedure states if you would like to challenge this book and remove it from all students. Like, that's all we're asking. Like, let the communities decide. So I think just stressing, like, you know, it's emotional to do this work because we all care about the freedom to read. We care about our kids and we care about the books that are being taken away, the authors that have been impacted by all of this craziness. But yeah, I think just approaching people with like kindness and respect and common sense and referring back to existing policies that they usually wrote and approved and voted on can be really effective too.
You know, I want to add that sometimes you're not going to be successful, right? If we look at like Anne knows this in her school district, and I know it all too well in my school district, is right now we're not in a great place and we've fought really hard and we're still losing books all the time. And sometimes it feels grim, but so just know that you're not always going to be successful, but that it's worth taking a stand, right? It's worth saying, hey, this isn't right. Like, I'm going to take a stand to censorship. I'm going to stand here and say that this is unacceptable, and I'm going to fight for my kids' First Amendment rights. So yeah, just know that I wish that it was always very successful, and it's not always very successful. You know, if there was one thing we would recommend in your districts, let's say they want to write a new policy, there's one thing that we have found, the policy that will save a book 9 times out of 10, especially a book that shouldn't be pulled, is that the book be evaluated as a whole. That every book that's evaluated before, say someone challenges a book, every district's going to have a policy where someone can come in and say, I want you to pull this book from shelves. We want you to remind your trustees in your districts, and we want them to put it in policy. And it is recommended policy. So the state has said, this is recommended policy, that these books be read in their entirety when they're evaluated, that you cannot take sections out of context, that you read them as a whole and you evaluate it that way. And when you do that, I would say that's what's going to save appropriate books, right? Will there be books occasionally that get pulled off of shelves? Yes. Will I always agree with that decision? Maybe not, right? But it's really important that we look at books in their entirety and not reduce them to a checklist. And so we want you to push for that in your communities. It looks like we kind of hit about time. Okay. Oh, it says Tracy Fisher. What about superintendents who ban books without the board's approval? Oh, Tracy Fisher, this happens scarily way too often. And that is what, go back to what Anne said. What is the policy and did they follow it? This is where you might need to submit a public information request. You might need to send a few emails and say, what happened here? Show me the paper trail of how this book was pulled off of the shelves. And if policy wasn't followed, if they did not follow the proper protocol to evaluate the book, then you demand they do it. File a grievance. Let them know that, hey, policy was violated here. There are not very many school districts probably, although some are going to try, where superintendents get to make a unilateral decision to ban books. So read what your policy says. It's always going to be in EF. That's the name of your book policy. Every district in Texas has the same named policy, EF. It will tell you what the procedure is to follow to pull books off of shelves. And if they aren't following it, you hold their feet to the fire and say, you need to follow this policy. That's what I would suggest.
Yeah, and this is the kind of thing you can bring up in public comment in a school board meeting. This is the kind of thing that you can send an email to a trustee about. Yeah, I've definitely seen cases where superintendents or people under superintendents were doing this and they were sometimes doing it to keep pressure off of the board, but the board wasn't aware and definitely didn't approve of it. And so, yeah, we should probably talk briefly. We don't have a ton of time to talk about public information requests, but it is important to know that a lot of this information you have a right to discover. You have a right to send an email asking to see these things. Every school district has a section on its website that tells you how to request public information. And learning to do that can be a really effective way to make sure that you're aware of what's going on in your district.
Okay. All right. Well, I think seems like we've touched on everything that needs to be touched on at this level. Unless Anne, Frank, Lainey, is there anything else you want to say?
I just want to close, and I know this is really silly, but we want to reiterate, and we always say it as an organization, we don't want children to have access to pornography. We do not want pornography in public school library shelves. And we do not believe every book is appropriate for every child to read. But we do believe that students have rights to be able to walk into a library and access information. And just because it's inappropriate does not mean they get to make that decision for every child in the school district. And so just as we're a part of this, we just remind people of that. Different people have different life experiences and have different tolerances for different things. If a book is truly pornography, we don't want it in schools. No one wants it in schools. That's not what we're talking about here at all. We're talking about books that are so valuable to the human experience, to understanding the world around you, that are going to help students make choices for their own lives to save themselves, right? Whether that's about consent in sexual relationships, or whether that's about drug use, or whether that's about navigating the world of like racial injustice. It doesn't matter whether or not you like that book, or that, some parent wishes their kid didn't have access to it. These parents don't get to make that decision for everyone. So just as you're out there fighting, just, remember that's kind of where we stand on things, and to have that perspective, and it'll help you kind of have a better understanding of what it is you're fighting for.
Well, this has been really good. I think the three of y'all are so informative and can be a great resource for the rest of us who want to get involved in this area. I think this has just been excellent, and we will definitely get back to you. Grandparents, we move slowly, but we'll definitely get back to you. And we'll figure out what we can do together. And this, like I said, this is recorded, so I will put it on the GPS Facebook page and make an announcement through our website announcement system that this is available. So again, thank you very much. And any of the viewing audience want to say anything before we go? Okay. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate it, and we will see you around, no doubt about it. Thank you.